Okay, so welcome to the Undergraduate Research Education Series. Welcome back if you have ever attended a live version or watched a video previously. I am very excited that there are so many of you here. It looks like there are 109 of you right now, which is just magical. I'm going to start us off doing just a little bit of housekeeping, and then we are going to hear from, learn from, have a conversation with Ella Blanchard about microaggressions and research. So for those of you who have logged in real time to this Zoom call, you do not have to fill out the evaluation form for the education series. Your login counts as your attendance. We have that already recorded. For those of you watching the video later, please do go to the Undergraduate Research Education Series page and click on that evaluation form, fill it out. That is what counts as your attendance for watching the video later.
And if you say nice things, you get to count the attendance twice, right? No? Okay, sorry.
But if you say nice things, it's great for us to know, because then we can continue to schedule this session because we know that it benefited you. I'm going to drop the link to the evaluation form into the chat though. So if you are attending in real time and want to fill out the evaluation, you're more than welcome to, and it is very helpful for us to hear from you. Ella, do you have the land acknowledgement in your slides?
I do.
Okay.
Well,
I'm not going to do it.
I can't remember which one I have. If you need the actual universities one.
No, I like yours better. I stole it and modified it, and that's the one I use.
Well, I can't remember. I might actually have that one now too. Let me look at it. Oh, yep. I switched to the universities one to try and be a team player.
That is okay. I won't do it so that we don't repeat it. And then I am now done with housekeeping. So Ella, take it away.
All right. Well, hello, I'm Ella. I answer best to she, her, hers pronouns. And I work at the University of Utah in the Office for Inclusive Excellence, which means that I get to talk about bias and power and microaggressions quite a bit. I'm happy to spend some time with you today. Shiver and I have been partnering for quite a while, and then Sandra has been joining that partnership for the last couple of times as we try to tailor that in a short, abbreviated 60 minutes that's focused on research. And so that focusing is going to be done primarily by you as researchers. And so I'm going to ask us some guiding questions for our conversation that will hopefully, you can bring some research-minded perspective into. Before I get any further, let me share that land acknowledgement. Okay, I will go ahead and read it. So the University of Utah has both historical and contemporary relationships with Indigenous peoples. Given that the Salt Lake Valley has always been a gathering place for Indigenous peoples, we acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes, and is a crossroad for Indigenous peoples. The University of Utah recognizes the enduring relationships between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We are grateful for the territory upon which we gather today. We respect Utah's Indigenous peoples, the original stewards of this land, and we value the sovereign relationships that exist between tribal governments, state governments, and the federal government. Today, approximately 60,000 American Indian and Alaska Native peoples live in Utah. As a state institution, the University of Utah is committed to serving Native communities throughout Utah in partnership with Native nations and our urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. And then here's a little draft of a labor acknowledgement. So we also pause to recognize and acknowledge the labor upon which our country, state, and institution are built. We remember that our country is built on the labor of enslaved people who were kidnapped and brought to the US from the African continent, and recognize the continued contribution of their survivors. We also acknowledge all immigrant labor, including voluntary, involuntary, trafficked, forced, and undocumented peoples who contributed to the building of the country and continue to serve within our labor force. We acknowledge all unpaid caregiving labor. Finally, we acknowledge that our institution relies on hourly, student, contingent, and unpaid labor and we recognize those contributions. And before we just leave that, a really common critique of land acknowledgements and labor acknowledgements also is that we just say it as some sort of form of academic liberal ritual, and then we just go on with our day and don't even talk about it anymore. And so I want to make sure that we don't do that. So land acknowledgements aren't perfect. Labor acknowledgements aren't perfect. I too could critique some of them. But I want us to at least use it as an invitation to an entry to a conversation about colonization, about systemic and institutional racism. And we can talk about that in what we're talking about today. So when we're talking about bias and power and microaggressions, these things also relate to colonization and our hopeful decolonization work. It impacts our conversations on race and racism as well. And so I'm hoping that when we're talking about bias, power, and microaggressions today, one way in which we can revisit these land acknowledgements and this labor acknowledgement and not just use it and move on is that I'm hoping that we can pull examples from our lives of the ways in which colonization and racism are present tense experiences. They're not historical only. And so when we're talking about microaggressions, please feel free to talk about those. Some of the microaggressions I'm bringing to our conversation today are going to pull from that history and that present. So do you have anything you want to add, Sandra or Shiver? That's just the start of it. Okay. All right. Well, let's get each other talking to each other. So with that in mind, I want us to get into some breakout rooms. Let me see, create 20 million breakout rooms. Wow, okay. We're gonna do 30 breakout rooms of 3 to 4 people in a room. And it's just gonna be 5 minutes. And I have a guiding question for you. So if you're listening to other things or you're trying to multitask, that's totally cool. I do that in some meetings too. But just for the next 5 minutes, at least try and be present with your partners. And I want you to talk about how does bias surface in research, either your research or the research that you've participated in the past. And again, bonus points if you can harken back to that land acknowledgement and labor acknowledgement and think about those types of biases specifically would be awesome. All right. Are there any questions about the prompt? One more time, it's how does bias surface in research? And if there's any questions, you can either yell them out or you can put them in the chat if you're shy, introverted, or anxious, or if you just want to. And then Shiver put the prompt in the chat as well for you to reference. Okay, I'm gonna open the rooms. There should be a 5-minute clock in the corner for you to reference, and then make sure that everyone gets a chance to talk, all 3 to 4 people. All right, I'll see you in a little bit. Bye. All right, well, welcome back. Does anyone feel comfortable sharing some experiences with bias in research? You can, well, probably don't raise your actual hand because I might not see you. There's 6 screens. But yeah, your virtual hand, you're doing it great. Is it Deja? All right, let it rip. What's your example, Deja?
So in our group, I had brought up the idea of the way that people perceive like underrepresented, marginalized groups. And I brought up an example of how like I do organizing in the Valley. And I remember like reading through some news articles in terms of like the polarization with people wanting to have their kids like return back to in-school teaching, but like the way that would reflect. And a lot of like affluent neighborhoods, like rich white families on the east side were like, we want our kids to go back. And like, I'm sure that like marginalized communities want their kids to go back to school because that's where they get daycare and like free lunch and get taken care for because they're working families. And then like people that I know on the west side were like, no, we don't, because one, we don't have health care. And if we get exposed, like our kids get exposed, and it comes back to our family members, especially if they live in like a not like a neo-nuclear household, like you have like your elders, you have parents, and so like that could transpire there. And so that was just kind of like tying back to research, like having these like kind of like romanticize assumptions about the way that like marginalized groups function and what they want, which like
Yes.
really like reflect like it's like the class character and like all that. So anyways, I said that I would stop because I could pop off, but
Yeah, that's okay. I come from a culture of popping off, so thank you for bringing it. I really appreciate that. Yeah, so sometimes bias can surface in these like weird, assumptive, almost savory ways as well. And I was hearing a lot of different motivations for that implicit bias that surfaces in very overt and discriminatory ways. Thank you, Deja. And the way that those assumptions are baked into our research sometimes too, that we think we're going to find certain answers, and the unofficial armchair researchers and all of us, as we read opinion boards and things, and the assumptions we make about why things are happening the way that they are. Thank you very, very much. Anybody else have an example they want to share? Is it Lex?
It is Lex, yes.
Hi, Lex.
So I mostly do research with history, and I think the obvious example is that there's a lot of erasure that happens with history research. And for me, like the quintessential example is just they were really good friends. They were just friends. Friends.
Yeah.
But there's also conversation to be had about who gets researched and in what way, where there are a lot of communities and groups that just haven't had research done for them, and that becomes a problem in history, but more specifically in like medical advances and the way that people are talked about in medicine is one that came up in our conversation.
Nice. Did you have an example about how people were talked about in medicine?
Having the experience of having grown up female, the idea of like, I am in a lot of pain. Cool, great, go home, you're good. That kind of idea of like the symptoms that women can express can be different than those of men. And that wasn't known for a very long time and still isn't known as well as it should be. So the way that women have been treated as men in medicine, because we're all the same, really.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Lex. And then, of course, like in keeping with our call to like reflect back on our labor and land acknowledgement, the ways that gender gets racialized as well is something that comes to mind. There's tons and tons of brilliant people who have spoken to this better than I can, but the way in which Black women specifically are treated as though pain isn't a thing that is experienced in the same way. And so in the medical field. Lex, really quickly, you mentioned historically the bias surfacing and thinking that people are just friends. Were you, I don't want to put words in your mouth, are you talking about like queer historical
Yes.
relationships? Okay, cool.
Yes, I am. And the idea that they, you know, being gay was invented in the 20th century, clearly.
Yeah. Okay.
That kind of idea is the community that I come from and get more irked by when I'm looking at historical research. So
Thanks. I wanted to double check because as a big old queer, I was in danger of my own biases projecting onto what you were saying. So, all right, awesome. Thank you very, very much. There was a virtual hand up earlier that just got put down and I didn't catch the name. Oh, is it you? Is it Jorge?
Yeah, that's my name. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we kind of expanded what we were talking about bias into kind of just research justice or equality and access. Since we were talking about gender and things like that, thought it would relate just because a lot of us work in a 9 to 5 and we have volunteers. We hope that those volunteers are able to come to a lab between the 9 to 5 time. And that can really skew the types of people that are able to be participants in a study. If you're a working person that can't miss a day of work, it's really hard to be a participant. And also just the physical barrier of if you live on the west side, you have no form of private transportation and it'll take an hour and a half to commute up. That can really skew what kind of research you're getting, or participants, I should say.
Yeah, thanks. There's been so much work about the bias within research catering to a specific set of demographics within higher ed, right? And I think, especially as we think about marginality, that's probably even more the case when your research questions get more focused in the margins. You're going to get, so say you're doing research on trans experience, there's a very, very specific subset of demographics of trans people who are able to access a higher education, right? And so you're going to get a very specific trans experience when it comes to that. Similar things have been talked about when doing research in Indigenous communities, Native American communities, that there's this kind of polarization of data, whether people are really focused on reservation experience versus urban experience. And it doesn't blend often enough in research that happens. I'm really bad at having a present conversation with people on the camera and reading the chat at the same time. So now I'm just going back to the chat, and Jasmine's given some love. I think I want to say it was to who was that to? Probably, was it Deja about popping off? That's my guess. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Love for you, Deja. And then just to add on to what Lex says, I was going to say, oh, okay, great. Sorry to steal your thunder, Sumaya. And Jordan, I don't know how to raise my hand, but I also have something going off of what Lex said. Bring it, Jordan. Go ahead.
So back on what she was saying about like Black women specifically being treated different in medicine, or I guess women, but anyway, it was a widely held belief for a long time that Black people, didn't feel pain in the same way or had less sensitive nerve endings. Their blood didn't coagulate as quickly. And I don't know if that was based in research, but it influences how people are treated in medicine. And it was a study done, I think back in 2016, where they found that med students still, 40% of them thought that Black people didn't feel pain in the same way. And I think somebody posted a source about it. So, but yeah, and that definitely influences how people, like these are the people who are going to be doctors and who are going to be doing research, and they have this implicit bias that, they might not even know is wrong because it's just something that's left over from so many years of historical, mistreatment.
Really, yeah, and a really good example of it being a present tense experience, not just historical.
Yeah.
And then just to really clarify one little piece, so when we say that people, it was widely held, what we mean is white people widely held that thinking. So I just wanted to clarify that little piece too.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Angela, your digital virtual hand is up.
We just talked a little bit about how academic institutions in it of itself is like kind of crappy. For example, it's like a lot of research is really focused on quantitative data instead of qualitative data. And in doing that, you lose like a lot of the cultural context important to some of the context that you're learning about. And then on top of that, there's just like so much mistrust in marginalized communities for the academic institutions, which is fairly there. And so there's this inability to work on focusing on some of those needs as well in marginalized communities outside of academia.
Yes, thank you very, very, very much. And I think, is it pronounced Mai in the chat? It is talking about the views around headaches and migraines and historical views of hysteria. Did you have something you wanted to add to that, Mai, or is that?
Oh, why I keep talking?
I can, I just learned recently that like historical views of women were that if they showed like any mental health symptoms, seizures, just things that weren't considered normal, people would just diagnose them with hysteria. And it was really related to sexist views on like women's sexual reproductive organs. They were like, oh, it comes from the womb, and all sorts of the problems with that. But as someone who gets chronic headaches and migraines, I've seen a lot of other issues that our current relationships with the woman in health can be seen as psychotic or like making her symptoms larger than they actually are. And so that really dehumanizes, I think, people when they try to get help for chronic pain or migraines or like things that aren't necessarily physical symptoms. Like it's not like my arm's cut off, but I get headaches X number of days a month, And so there is less likelihood for doctors to go into migraines and headaches and things that are not physical in nature, because there's such a big bias against it. And I think a lot of women aren't taken seriously when it comes to these types of situations because of that.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a lot we could talk about who is believed and whose pain is real, right? And it has everything to do with gender, but it also has everything to do with race. It has everything to do with ethnicity, has to do with language, your first spoken language, if you have a noticeable accent for folks. So who is believed? Yeah. And then also like not just the binary cisnormative genders and sexualities as well. Allison, I think you were first, but Per, you totally fight me if you were first.
I just okay. I want to go first because I just want to add on the topic because let's talk about because I have heard about this myth from gender and sexuality class, and they talked about how racial bias also like play a role on this assumption as well. Okay, so I think the historical like assumption has that like Black women has like a bigger genitalia, and that leads to like likelihood to become like lesbian.
Huh.
Yeah, so like okay, that's another
heard.
assumption.
Okay.
Yeah, that's another
Okay.
assumption as well. And yeah, and we
Messed
talked
up.
a lot about like these assumption actually like leads to the access to like Black women's like genitalia, like because like I don't know, doctors had these assumptions. That's why they kind of like, you know what? That's why we have to research on your genitalia and stuff. And you know, like that's a private part. But like the doctor's power, it's yeah, what's really great in the historical time, and it was like lead to like the study of like people's genitalia and connect that assumption to like lesbianism and like Black women as well. So yeah.
Well, okay, so those are some new messed up biases that I hadn't heard before.
Yeah,
So
it's
been doing this a
painful
long
to
time.
hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But I just want to add that. Yeah.
All right, Allison, did you have something you wanted to add? And then I'm thinking we probably need to have another breakout room and talk about power. All right.
Well, I'm gonna deviate slightly from the topics we've been talking about, but
As
I work in.
I welcome it.
Perfect. I work in an organic lab, and my dad is also like, well, he's involved in like cancer research, and so I often like edit papers for him because English is not his first language, and it brings up a really big bias, like in like the communities that I'm in, scientific communities I am, English is like the #1 language you use and is basically the only language you use in like literature writing. And so that poses a problem for people who like aren't learning English as the first language. Like I'm not necessarily educated in the things that they're talking about, but my name gets put on a paper because I know English and I help them correct it. Whereas someone who works really, really hard on this project, you know,
yes,
and does all of the research, they still have to face those problems because, you know,
yeah,
it's inherent in the world that we are that you have to write in English. And it's kind of complicated because you do need like a lingua franca in order to communicate like information, but it also brings the question of, you know, if someone wants to write a paper in their own first language, how are we going to accommodate for that?
Thank you, Allison. I didn't find that deviated at all. So that was totally germane to the conversation. And just to, before I send you out into breakout rooms yet again, I want us all to just take a moment of personal reflection. You don't have to share your answer with me or anyone else. And for folks who are watching this recording later, you just like pause if you need, but think about the kind of everyday assumptions that people make around intelligence based on identity. And I think language and accent is absolutely one of those factors. So a person might be a very, very brilliant person, but not speak English as their first language, and they get talked down to. and treated as though they are less intelligent, right? So there's a condescension that happens within, if we were to have a conversation about ableism for a moment. So there's a condescension that happens to folks in wheelchairs that's really well documented and talked about all the time within community. So just thinking about when is my paternalism, meaning acting like a parent, when is my paternalism surfacing in my interactions with other people? And then thinking as a researcher, how do I check that very proactively? How do I account for that and think about that? Thank you very, very much, Allison. Allison, did you have something more to say, or is your digital hand just still up from before? Oh, okay, I'm gonna take it that it's not. Okay, I'm gonna send you back into some breakout rooms, and I'm gonna recreate the rooms. If you're like me, I need different faces sometimes. So that way, if it was great for you, I'm sorry. And if the last room was hard for you, you're welcome. All right, so I'm gonna recreate 30 breakout rooms, so 3 to 4 people in each room. And this time the prompt is, how does power surface in research? Either your own research, and bonus points if you can think about your own power, not just the ways in which you don't have power or somebody has power over you. So how does power affect research? And recreating the rooms, again, it's just 5 minutes. I will see you back in 5 minutes. Welcome back, folks. I think people have 42 seconds left to join us, so we'll just give them a little bit. Thank you, thank you. In 15 seconds, there's going to be the big crush of everybody else. Okay, I think that's everybody. Welcome back, folks. Thank you very, very much. Before we dive into our quick conversation about power, I just want to give a shout out to Bianca for naming professionalism connected to whiteness, and not just whiteness, but white supremacy culture. And so it's really important to constantly revisit that. Shiver, were you able to find that?
It's uploading to the chat right now.
Okay, cool. So Shiver's gonna upload a zine in the chat of Tema Okun's work on white supremacy culture, in case you're not familiar with that work. And I like the zine version because it's got pictures and it's interactive a little bit, and so it's easier for me to digest. But renaming some things that get called professionalism a lot of the time and recentering that in a more critical conversation. So that goes for things like dress codes. I think Jordan was putting some stuff in the chat. So dress codes, but also like, drugs, and then also accents and well-spoken. But I would also add things like punctuality, senses of time, monochronic versus polychronic senses of time. And then also what comes up a lot of the time that I think, especially in research, but in higher ed as a whole, is what gets called the worship of the written word. And so just thinking about how we value things that are written sometimes a lot more than things that are spoken or experienced bodily, that sometimes we grasp and grapple with. Visible tattoos. Are you talking about the professionalism and dress code stuff? Mai? Okay, thanks. All right. So with that said, I also want us to have a little bit of time to dive into at least a few examples of common microaggressions and then tease them apart. So I'm thinking maybe 5-ish minutes. I might eat my words, but let's try and spend like about 5-ish minutes on power. So that definitely won't solve power dynamics in research, but honestly, neither would an hour. So let's talk a little bit. Does anybody want to share what they talked about in their group or what they shared from their own experience around power and research? Oh, Ryan brought in the pictures for our ID badges, and Lex brought in hair. Yeah. Yeah. When you look at the history of Kodak and like what colors are represented in cameras and in photography, man, racist. All right, cool. Thank you very, very much, Ryan. That's definitely some Google homework for folks if you're not familiar with that history. Does anyone want to share about power and research? Yeah, is it Tori? Okay, go for it, Tori.
Yeah, so I was thinking about trying to think about the power that I held as a researcher. And so the research that I do is qualitative research, and it's on patients with type 1 diabetes, and specifically where multiple members of a family have type 1 diabetes, and kind of explaining their interactions and family dynamics, because it's not talked about as much as it should be. They're a very unique and special family type to have. So when I was thinking about that, and where we do such qualitative data, I realized that these families are really putting a lot of trust into us to tell their stories and to accurately portray, their struggles, but also like the good and the bad that come from their situations. And so we have a lot of power in being able to tell their story and share it with the world. And I think it's really important that we do that in an appropriate way. And then thinking further on that, I was just thinking, we kind of talked about this in the group that I was in, was that all of our research gets published in these scientific journals that you most likely have to have a subscription to even be able to access, or be at an institute of higher ed that pays for a subscription for you to view them. And so a lot of this research that you do isn't even available to the general public, and may not even be available to your participants to access and seek out on their own. So it's like a big power of, they're giving us a lot. We couldn't do our research without them, but there's a dynamic in how we're able to share it with them.
Thank you very, very much, Tori. That's perfect. We have time for maybe one more. Does anybody else want to share? All right, is it Deja? Go for it.
I'll make it very quick so I don't take too much time. In our group, I brought up the allocation of funding in general for research, and like the way that like those power structures like influence the way that even the outcome of your data is, because like depending on what you're researching with that funding, they like your sponsor or whatever like higher board that gives you that funding wants a specific outcome, and if you don't meet that standard, then you like consequentially like get reduced funding, or maybe like kicked off of that research, like if worst case scenario. And that's like just something that reflects on like a lot of different areas, like even thinking about like how think tanks like in a political realm like fund millions of dollars to like have some like certain like pay people to say something, and like maybe spread like disinformation, and that's like a huge thing. And even like for like like credited researchers, that like you can still use your research in a way that makes like a biased outcome, and so funding is like such a huge thing.
Thank you very, very much. So I'm thinking, I always like want to share some tangibles and not just theory when we have these conversations. And so I think those are two really good tangibles that we can think about just in those two examples of power and research. So hopefully that brings to mind in the research that you do or will be doing, and thinking about. So for the first example of power is like the amount of trust. I really love the naming of the trust that research participants have in folks, and then thinking actively about how can I be trustworthy as a researcher, right? So as a tangible, what might that mean? A few things were named, right? So sharing our results, sharing what we're publishing, not asking people to go begging for it. And then also thinking about, I mean, as they were talking about this experience with research, I could see the University of Utah in my mind, literally on a hill, looking down on the rest of the population, right? And so just thinking about, there's a reason why sometimes we name this gap. It gets called a gap a lot of times, I've found in higher ed culture, of marginality and different people not feeling like the university and higher education is accessible. But it's important to flip that on its head. It's not that people are just making that feeling up out of nowhere, right? So what are we doing as an institution, as the university, to make us be and seem and appear inaccessible. And some of that might have to do with your research you're producing. So we can't maybe fix all of the university. Maybe you don't have that power. If you do, that's great. And I want to talk about some other things I want us to fix. But if you don't, at the very least, thinking about your own research and how I cannot replicate the same harm. That's a really easy tangible to think about. I'm going to make my knowledge accessible, right? So how do we do that? Thank you very much. And then Deja's point about funding, right? So how much of our behavior is guided by an unchecked and uncritiqued capitalist system of knowledge, right? And not to put words in your mouth, Deja, so just wreck me if I say something that you don't mean.
You said capitalist and I'm like happy.
Okay, so I've worked in nonprofits as well, where sometimes our mission is like community and it's high-minded and our mission statements sound really good and we're here for community. But the truth is, a lot of times it's directed by funding. And so if we get a grant that is very focused and wants us to focus in one area, all of a sudden you find the whole nonprofit's focus shifting. And I don't think that that's accidental. I don't think that's just a coincidence. And so thinking about, for our research, a tangible might be, how can I make sure that this is widely helpful and not just for folks that are moneyed, right? And then also thinking about the future, how you want to challenge that kind of capitalist system of knowledge. What are some ways I can subvert that and highlight and uplift knowledge that isn't bought and paid for by certain people that already want the results? Okay, thank you very, very much. We are so at time. All right, let me think. So for 9 minutes, I'm gonna share a couple of quick examples of microaggressions. And I want us to talk about them and then we'll be done. And so here is PowerPoint again. Okay, really quickly, it wasn't just because that we talked about bias and power. It's absolutely central to understanding microaggressions. And so it's not that we're changing gear. This is just a continuation of the same conversation. A lot of times people don't know what microaggressions mean, and there's some really common misunderstandings. One really common misunderstanding, a pattern that I would name in the work I do around microaggressions, is people say, oh, I just can't say anything anymore. I don't know if you've heard some version of that. But that comes from a misunderstanding, thinking that our goal when we talk about and work in bias, power, and microaggressions is to come up with a list, a censorship list. These are good words and these are bad words. That is not at all what we're doing. So most words have a context. There might be a very harmful context and a very positive context. I'm not here to tell you that certain words are forbidden. I might suggest that some words might be bad coming out of your mouth or your body. To think about your experience and your positionality is always an important thing, but also context matters. And so maybe what we talk about with people we know really well might not be our best opener when getting to know somebody for the first time. Another pattern that comes up in a misunderstanding of microaggressions is this idea that it's about hurt feelings. So people say like, oh, people are so sensitive. I don't know if you've heard that before. And that comes from thinking that all we're talking about is hurt feelings, but it's not. When we're talking about microaggressions, I can absolutely say something and mean it as a compliment, mean it friendly. And another person can hear that. So I might say something to Shiver that's microaggressive and mean it as a compliment. And Shiver might actually even hear it as a compliment. No hurt feelings were had. And it was just the two of us in a room, no one else. And it's still a microaggression because microaggressions have to do with bias and power. And so I'm going to share a couple of examples. And what I'm hoping we can do as a group is I want us to talk about the bias and power behind these microaggressions. So not hurt feelings, although that's always welcome. I'm a big feeler. I'm a water sign. We can talk about feelings. But I want us to focus on bias and power and pick that apart a little bit. If that feels too abstract to you, sometimes it feels too abstract to me. Another cheat I use in my head, instead of saying bias and power, I just say, what is the unspoken message? What's behind this? Okay, So that's another way to do it if that's helpful. So this first one is one of the most common microaggressions I've witnessed, and that's the "where are you from" microaggression. So the picture is somebody that says, "Where are you from?" And the other person says, "Portland." And then the first person says, "No, where are you really from?" Does anybody want to take a crack at talking about what's the unspoken message? What's behind this? Where's the bias and the power? And right now I can only see 5 faces. So if you talk, let me know who you are.
I mean, I can. My name is Allison. I don't know if you can
Hi,
hear me.
Allison. Yes.
I get this question a lot. I am Asian, so and I was born in the US. So when people ask this question, it's more of a, how did you get here? And like one of the comments I've gotten is, "Oh, you speak such good English." So when they ask, "Oh, where are you really from?" or like, "Where are you from?" it's kind of like trying to gauge like how intelligent you are, or like how, like, I think that's like the main feeling I get. It's like, "Oh, how intelligent are you? How well do you speak? How educated are you?"
Yes. Thank you very, very much, Allison. And some folks are naming it in the chat as well. So it absolutely, if we're talking about bias and power structures, it absolutely has to do with race and racism. It also has to do with autism and discrimination around accents. And then somebody else, Wilbur, mentioned not belonging. So some of the unspoken message is one of belonging. Maya wrote othering just now. And then Sumaya wrote this idea of, if you're not white, you're not white, so you must not be from here. So there's a bias, a conflation of race and geography that I think is really important to name in that for a lot of people who say this microaggression or perform this microaggression, it's a confusion of thinking that you can tell where someone is from by looking at them, right? And that might be obviously harmful to some of us, and to some of us that might feel not obviously harmful, but it plays out in incredibly harmful ways. Sometimes it gets called the perpetual foreigner. It's a way of reminding people that you do not belong here. And you might live in a place for 30, 40, or 50 years and still not be from there, right? So when we're talking about when we're talking about home, we're talking about belonging. Again, we've talked about layers to other things. I would also add a queerness to this aspect as well. For a lot of queer and trans folks, there's a familial trauma that happens when we talk about home. And so, especially for queer and trans folks of color, I think thinking about just saying, "Where are you from? Where is home?" can be a really fraught conversation anyway, just on top of everything else. So I just wanted to weave in that other layer as well. All right, thank you. And when I'm sharing my screen, I'm horrible at keeping up with chat, even more horrible than before. So if anybody wants to chime in with something that's germane and comes up, that would be great. Here's another example. And we'll probably just finish with this one. It's the "what's your spirit animal" microaggression. Does anyone want to share this one? So when does this come up? First, let's just talk about, when does this question get asked? Have you ever heard this question asked before? And I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see you all again. The microaggression is, "what's your spirit animal?" And somebody wrote social media, camp icebreakers. And I think you mean like summer camp, not camp as in like the queer theory phenomenon. If you mean the queer thing, then let me know. Yeah, summer camp. Okay, thanks, Kylie. Hear it at slumber parties. Yeah, so it's like a getting to know you exercise, right? What is the bias and power behind that? What's the unspoken message? What's the harm? Nathan, your virtual digital hand is up.
Yes. So yeah, second thing, the context of just like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna get to know you," but it's like, that's like a fundamental aspect of like indigenous people's belief structures. Like, you don't go around asking people like, what's your God like? What does your deity do? And that's because, in our fundamental power structure in our society, it's not cool to appropriate or desacralize, Christian, Judeo-Christian motifs, but indigenous motifs, absolutely.
Oh, Nathan, you just used a word I hadn't heard before, but I like. I think it was desacralize. Is that okay? I just want to make sure my trauma brain didn't make that word up. All right. Yes. Thank you, Nathan. Desacralize. Yeah, there's a lot to critique in the way that desacralizes things that are very sacred. I also want to bring in that, again, with our land acknowledgement and our labor acknowledgement, it's important that we name the colonization in this. So it's not just about spirituality and religion, but specifically a colonizer, settler colonial attitude of extinguishing, of genocide, and then appropriating and treating as though it's fun, fashionable, and trendy. So yeah, there's a history of boarding schools. There's a history of a lot of things. Again, more Google homework for y'all because we're at time right now. But thinking about this history and present of punishing people for practicing ancestral spirituality and language, and then to turn around and show up in a getting to know you summer camp activity or in orientation at the university, and to have that thing that was fought against so hard and extinguished from your heart and the core of you to be used as just a trite thing that no one treats as sacred, desacralized. There's a lot of compounding trauma in that. So thank you very, very much. I see that there's a ton in the chat. I've learned that when I don't end on time, though, that is the only thing that people remember and not what we talked about and what we learned together. So I want to make sure that we're done on time. I love you all. Thank you very much for participating. I feel like we had a robust conversation, as robust as we could with 100+ people. But thank you for thinking critically about power, bias, and microaggressions, and then thinking about tangible ways you can do that within your sphere of influence with research. So have a great, hopefully weekend. If you're not done early, you can tell them that a leggy trans woman told you that you were done early and give them my email address. Okay. Thank you, y'all.
And if you are interested in filling out the evaluation form, please do. It's always a help to us, but you're not required to.
And it doesn't have to be nice things. You can also say other things. I was just joking. It was my attempt at levity.